Can you please state your full name for the record?
Erica Isamar Peña.
Okay.
David picked me up. Yeah.
Okay. Now, when he drove up, what did he drive up in?
In his white Dodge. We drove to his house. As soon as we entered the house, David wasn't himself anymore. Very nervous. I just got this feeling that kept me thinking.
Thinking what?
That maybe he was the one.
He was the one that what?
That had been murdering.
What, if anything, did he do with the gun?
He just pointed it right at me.
When he pointed it at you, show the ladies and gentlemen of the jury where he pointed to you.
Right here at my face. I run to the store and there's a trooper. I'm crying hysterically.
What happens when you get to the police station?
I tell them my story. I think they start pulling up pictures. And I said, yeah, that's him.
It's just past midnight on a humid September night in Laredo, Texas. The gas station is quiet until the door slams open. A woman stumbles in, barefoot, eyes wide, shaking. She's gasping for air, glancing back like someone's still chasing her. Her clothes are torn. Her voice is panicked. She grabs the first person she sees behind the counter and says, "He has a gun. He's been killing people. He was going to kill me." The store clerk calls 911. The dispatcher hears the fear in her voice. And within minutes, Laredo police arrive. What Erica Pena tells them doesn't sound real. A respected U.S. Border Patrol agent picked her up, just like he had before. But something was different this time. His voice was colder, the gun was visible, and he wasn't taking her anywhere safe. She waited for the moment he stopped the truck. And then she ran. No shoes. No time to think. Just survival. And that decision, to run, did more than save her life. It exposed the killer. One who had already taken 4 lives. One who believed no one would ever suspect a man in uniform. The man behind the badge was Juan David Ortiz. A decorated Navy veteran. A Border Patrol intel supervisor. A father. And a self-declared executioner of women he called dirty. This wasn't a moment of madness. This was a pattern. A spree. A mission. And Erica's escape, that single moment, was the first thread to unravel the entire thing. Juan David Ortiz wasn't a stranger to respect. He had served in the U.S. Navy as a corpsman, a role that placed him in some of the most harrowing situations of military life, saving lives under fire. After his discharge, he joined the U.S. Border Patrol, a position he would hold for nearly a decade. As a Border Patrol agent in Laredo, Texas, right along the U.S.-Mexico border, Ortiz had a reputation. He was diligent, a skilled intelligence supervisor. In a job like his, every action had to be precise. Every report, every decision, every lead carried weight. The Border Patrol wasn't just about chasing criminals across deserts. It was about protecting the border, controlling information, and often, making life and death choices. Ortiz was seen as competent. Respectable. Someone who had earned his position. He was a father, married, with 2 children, a family man living in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Laredo. His colleagues often described him as hardworking, even-tempered, reliable. On the surface, he was the ideal agent. The kind of man you'd want guarding the border, someone trusted to carry a weapon in defense of his country. But beneath that surface, something was rotting. There were signs. Small, almost imperceptible, at first. The first hint came from his behavior in the workplace. Ortiz had a discomforting obsession with prostitutes. He would often talk about them in a way that was unsettling to those around him. His comments weren't just casual, they were disturbing. He spoke about them as though they were beneath him, as if they were nothing more than tools for his own twisted desires. but these were whispers. Rumors. At first, no one took them seriously. Ortiz kept his personal life separate, as many did in his line of work. He kept a tight grip on his emotions, but it was hard to miss the subtle signs of stress. Colleagues noticed it. He was tense, his smile didn't reach his eyes. Some said he'd snap at little things. That was when they started noticing something darker lurking beneath the surface. He mentioned the women he picked up, not with any empathy, but with a strange sense of disdain. "They're just trash," he said once, in a conversation that would later haunt those who heard it. His language became more venomous over time. He would laugh off his rage, dismissing it as frustration over the state of things in Laredo, the crime, the drugs, the prostitution. He would make comments about cleaning up the streets. But it wasn't just talk. A year before he would be arrested, Ortiz's demeanor shifted. He became more erratic, his temper shorter. It was as if something inside him was coming undone, a psychological shift that no one could quite put their finger on. His obsession wasn't just casual anymore. The signs of his violent thoughts were there, clear, undeniable, if only anyone had been paying closer attention. But even those closest to him had no idea. This man who was trusted to uphold the law, to protect the public, had crossed a line. It was no longer just disdain. No longer just talk. He was planning something. Laredo, Texas, situated along the Rio Grande, a bustling border town where the line between two worlds seems to blur. It's a place where law enforcement, border patrol agents, and drug cartels play a constant, high-stakes game of cat and mouse. The air is thick with tension, as the U.S.-Mexico border stretches endlessly, and the dangers that come with it are never far behind. Laredo is a microcosm of the larger struggles playing out across the border: drugs, human trafficking, and violence. The streets of Laredo can feel like a powder keg, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite. On one side of the city, the Rio Grande, teeming with life but also filled with danger. On the other side, the ever-looming presence of cartels, pushing drugs northward into the United States, feeding an insatiable appetite. Violence is constant. The very nature of the city breeds a sense of urgency. The constant threat of violence from organized crime, the pressure on law enforcement to keep up with a rapidly changing landscape, it takes its toll. But there's another part of Laredo's story, one often overlooked. Sex work is a harsh reality in the area. Many of the women involved in the trade are often caught between the chaos of their circumstances and their need for survival. Laredo's border region, with its high demand for illicit services and transient nature, becomes a haven for those who have few options left. Some of these women came to Laredo seeking better lives, only to find themselves stuck in a cycle of exploitation. Others had no choice but to turn to the streets, often coming from other parts of Texas or Mexico, drawn into a world they couldn't escape. Their stories, often untold, remain in the shadows of society. And for many of them, Laredo was simply a place to survive. Some turned to sex work as a means of staying afloat. Others fell prey to it as they navigated the dangerous realities of a border town. These women, though vulnerable, were largely invisible to the wider world. They were marginalized, forgotten by many, and pushed to the edges of society. Their voices were often silenced by those who saw them as nothing more than disposable, anonymous figures, simply part of the background noise of a chaotic city. They had become invisible, until they started to disappear. In 2018, the first sign that something was wrong came when a woman, missing for weeks, turned up dead. At first, it seemed like another statistic, another life lost in a city already used to violence. But then, another woman disappeared. And another. The disappearances didn't immediately raise alarms in the way they should have. The streets of Laredo were no stranger to violence, to disappearances, to the unreported deaths of those society would rather forget. The women were sex workers, often seen as the least important, the most expendable members of the community. Their deaths weren't seen as a priority for many, their names forgotten, their stories dismissed as just part of the grim reality of border life. But as the disappearances continued, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. One woman, then another. Each of them was left discarded in the dark corners of Laredo, their lives violently ended. And while the killings went unnoticed by many, there were others who saw the grim connection. But even they didn't know just how far it had gone. No one had connected the dots yet. No one had suspected a man who wore a badge. Juan David Ortiz had been quietly observing his prey, blending into the shadows. To most people, he was just another face in the uniform, another law enforcement officer doing his job. But to the women on the streets, he was something else entirely. They had no idea how closely their paths were crossing with the man who would eventually claim their lives. The 4 women whose lives were taken in cold blood were more than just statistics. They were mothers, daughters, and sisters. They had hopes, dreams, and most importantly, they had stories that society chose not to hear until it was too late. Melissa Ramirez was 29 years old when she was found dead, her life violently cut short by a man she trusted. A mother of 3, she was known for her caring nature and her deep love for her children. Melissa had turned to sex work in the hopes of making ends meet after struggling with addiction. She had dreams of one day leaving the streets behind, providing a better life for her kids. She longed for normalcy, a fresh start, a way out. But in a town where survival was often more important than safety, she was trapped in a cycle. Her family remembers her as a woman with a kind heart, a woman who was always trying to take care of others despite her own struggles. But Melissa's death went unnoticed at first, just another body in a city already accustomed to violence. She was marginalized, forgotten until the next woman disappeared. Claudine and Luera was 42 years old when her body was discarded in a field just outside Laredo. She, too, had turned to the streets in a desperate attempt to survive. Claudine had always dreamed of a different life, one where she could leave the cycle of sex work behind. She was a woman with a sharp sense of humor, always quick to laugh despite the hardships she faced. She had been through much in her life, from addiction to abusive relationships, but like many women in her situation, she had no way out. Claudine had been trying to turn things around. She had reached out to family, seeking help to escape the life she found herself in. But for her, like so many others, the system failed her. She was seen as disposable, her death brushed off with little fanfare. Her family, devastated by her loss, was left to mourn a woman who had been forgotten by the world before her death ever registered as a tragedy. Giselda Alicia Cantu was a young woman with a bright future ahead of her, at least that's what her friends and family remember. She was only 18 years old when she was killed. A high school dropout, she had struggled with addiction and the loss of family support. Like many young women in vulnerable situations, Giselda had found herself caught in the world of sex work as a means to survive. Her family spoke of her with affection. She was a girl who had her whole life ahead of her, who had the potential to escape the harsh realities she faced. But the streets of Laredo, where danger lurked around every corner, swallowed her up. Her death was barely noticed. Her story lost among the countless others that came and went in a town where victims like her were nothing more than nameless, faceless casualties of circumstance. Janelle Ortiz, no relation to Juan David Ortiz, was 26 years old when she was murdered. Janelle had struggled with addiction for most of her adult life. She had dreams of a better future, a life away from the streets. But for Janelle, the road to escape was never easy. She had tried to get clean several times, but each time, the pull of addiction brought her back. Her family remembers her as loving and caring, but also as someone caught in a dangerous cycle. She had 3 children who were her world, and she had tried, time and time again, to get out of the life she had fallen into. But Janelle was just another woman on the streets of Laredo, living in the margins, largely ignored until it was too late. These 4 women, their names forgotten by most, were victims of a system that ignored them until they were gone. The women who disappeared were often seen as less than human, dismissed as nothing more than another part of Laredo's seedy underbelly. Their lives and struggles were invisible to a society that had long turned a blind eye to the most vulnerable members of the community. Each death seemed like another tragic, but unremarkable, part of the daily violence in the border region. Their stories, like so many others, were drowned out by the noise of crime and chaos. The deaths of these women were brushed off by many as just another tragic consequence of their circumstances, as if their lives were worth less than the lives of those who never knew their struggles.
I had a very good connection with her. It was amazing. It was just a blessing that I was able to meet her. I was there for her for 5 years, and it was the best 5 years of my life.
As a girl, Melissa was very joyful, very joyful. What can I say? She was a very good daughter, very noble, very happy.
You can go to San Bernardo and they're gonna be like, oh yeah, that's my girl Janelle. She had this personality that everyone liked about her. That she's always looked out for anyone around her. That's what everyone misses from her.
What do you miss most?
I miss her girl talks, her boy talks. I miss everything from her.
You know, me and her could bond over anything and everything, really. I mean, she was my best friend.
And you don't worry about her anymore?
No, because I know she's in the heavens above. She's resting peacefully. She's healed perfectly. All her suffering, all her pain, she's healed perfectly. And she's happy. That brings my heart some peace, knowing that she's in the heavens above.
I'll tell you what my sister was and what always will be. She would always be the 6-year-old little girl She was all I had, bro. She was all I had left. You took the last living member of my family, man. She would always be the 6-year-old little girl who would wake up in the middle of the night to walk her 8-year-old brother to the restroom because I was scared of the dark. She would always be the little sister who defended me from bullies when we were in elementary school, even fist fighting them. And she'll always be the little sister who cried just because she saw me crying.
No matter who they are, no matter what people say, they had families, they were mothers, they were daughters, they were sisters. They are loved.
With Erica Pena's courageous escape, law enforcement had their first real lead, but they needed more. They needed to find Ortiz. They needed to catch him before he could slip through their fingers. The first step was to trace Ortiz's vehicle. The authorities worked quickly, piecing together the details of the night Erica escaped. Surveillance footage from the gas station she had fled to was key. It provided the critical link. From there, investigators began to track down the make and model of the truck Ortiz had been driving, a crucial step that brought them closer to the truth. Soon, the manhunt began in earnest. The search for Juan David Ortiz was underway, and it didn't take long for the authorities to narrow down his possible location. A sense of urgency hung over the operation. This wasn't just any fugitive they were hunting. This was a man who had been part of the system, someone who had been entrusted with protecting the community, only to betray that trust in the most horrific way. Ortiz had been hiding in plain sight, blending in as a man who seemed like any other Border Patrol agent. But the man he had become in the shadows was far from ordinary. He was now on the run. As the police closed in on him, Ortiz retreated into a hotel parking lot in the outskirts of Laredo. It was a familiar place, one where he likely thought he could disappear into the night, away from the eyes of those closing in on him. But he was wrong. The authorities were moving swiftly, their net tightening with every minute. And then, in a moment of chilling clarity, Ortiz made contact with someone, his wife. He sent her a final text, a message that would forever change the course of their lives. Goodbye. It read. It was a message of finality, one that suggested he knew what was coming. Ortiz wasn't just hiding, he was preparing to face the consequences of his actions, whatever they might be. It wasn't clear whether he was trying to say goodbye to his family or whether he had already resigned himself to the inevitability of his capture. But his attempt at escape was futile. When the authorities arrived at the parking lot, they found Ortiz exactly where they expected him to be. There was no struggle, no attempt to run or resist. Ortiz was taken into custody without a fight. As the police moved in, there was an eerie calm about him. For a man who had spent months living in the shadows, hunting the most vulnerable women in Laredo, there was no panic, no desperate attempt to flee. Ortiz had, for all intents and purposes, given up. When he was brought in for questioning, law enforcement expected him to deny everything, to lie, to attempt to manipulate the truth. After all, he had been an officer of the law, a man who was supposed to uphold justice. But what happened next was nothing short of astonishing. Ortiz didn't deny a thing. In fact, when confronted, he confessed to everything.
God forgive you.
And then she said,
okay?
And then she was talking to me like that.
Just go away, okay? I'm telling you to walk away. Just walk away, okay? Walk away. She walks away, and then she comes back. I'm telling you to walk away. You're not listening to me.
The room fell silent as Ortiz spoke the words that would seal his fate. He admitted to killing 4 women, Melissa Ramirez, Claudine and Luara, Giselda Alicia Cantu, and Janelle Ortiz. The admissions were chilling, each word confirming the nightmare that had been unfolding in Laredo for months. He spoke of the killings with a disturbing sense of ease, as though it were nothing more than a matter of fact. No remorse. No guilt. Just a man, sitting in front of the officers who had once trusted him, confessing to a series of cold, calculated murders. "I was doing them a favor," Ortiz said, his voice devoid of emotion. The words hung in the air like a twisted justification, one that immediately struck a nerve with investigators. It wasn't just the lack of remorse that made his statement so chilling. It was the twisted logic behind it. To Ortiz, these women, the victims he had hunted, terrorized, and killed, were not human beings. They were nothing more than objects, disposable and worthless. In his eyes, their lives had no value, and he believed he was ridding the world of their filth. "They're dirty, they needed to be taken out," Ortiz continued, his words as callous as the actions they described. He spoke of the women he murdered not as people but as a scourge, something that needed to be eradicated. In his warped mind, these women were nothing more than their circumstances, defined by their occupation and their vulnerability. The confession went further into the dark recesses of Ortiz's psyche as he detailed the specific ways in which he had planned and carried out each murder. It wasn't an act of passion or heat of the moment. No, Ortiz had carefully chosen his victims, each one selected for reasons that only he understood. He had a pattern, a method. Each woman was picked not by chance but by design. Ortiz described the brutal killings in disturbing detail, as if recounting a routine he had grown accustomed to. The defense did little to counter the overwhelming evidence against Ortiz. There was no real attempt to dispute the confession, no attempt to explain away his actions. Instead, Ortiz's attorneys seemed to focus on the issue of mental health, trying to suggest that his actions had been the result of some deeper psychological condition. But these attempts fell flat. The prosecution had already made it clear that Ortiz's actions were not those of a man acting under duress or in a moment of mental instability. They were the actions of a man who had made a conscious decision to kill, to hunt, and to dehumanize his victims. And despite the defense's best efforts, Ortiz's fate seemed sealed. The jury deliberated, and after hours of discussion, they returned with a verdict: guilty of capital murder. The man who had worn a badge, who had been entrusted with the safety of others, was now going to face the consequences for his horrific crimes. The courtroom was tense as the verdict was read aloud. The victims' families, some of whom had waited years for this moment, sat in silence, their emotions carefully controlled, but their eyes telling the story of years of pain and grief. For them, this was more than just a legal victory. It was a long-awaited step toward justice. But it was also a reminder that no matter how the court ruled, the lives of their loved ones were still gone. The damage had been done. And then came the sentencing. The court had to decide what fate awaited Juan David Ortiz. Despite the horrific nature of his crimes, there was one thing that stood out. Prosecutors were not seeking the death penalty. In Texas, the death penalty is still a legal option for capital murder convictions, but in this case, the prosecution had opted to pursue a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Ortiz would never walk free again, and his life would be spent behind bars, with no chance of ever being released. The decision not to pursue the death penalty raised eyebrows. Some argued that Ortiz's crimes warranted the ultimate punishment, but others felt that life in prison without parole was a fitting punishment for a man who had taken lives without a shred of remorse. What mattered, however, was that Ortiz would never be able to kill again. His reign of terror had come to an end, and justice, in some form, had been served. As the gavel came down, sealing his fate, Ortiz's demeanor remained unchanged. He showed no emotion, no relief, no regret. He had been found guilty, but to him, it seemed like just another chapter in the twisted narrative he had created. There was no sense of closure in his face, no sense of understanding that what he had done had irrevocably altered the lives of so many. For the victims' families, the sentencing was only one step in the long process of healing. The trial had brought some measure of justice, but no amount of punishment could bring back their loved ones. It had been a long, painful road to this point, and yet, the grief and the loss remained. The trial may have concluded, but the effects of Ortiz's actions would continue to haunt them, as they had for so many years. When the final gavel came down, and Juan David Ortiz was sentenced to life in prison without parole, it was not the end of the story. It was not a simple conclusion, nor was it a straightforward moment of justice. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter for those who had been directly affected by his actions, the victims' families, the survivors, and the entire community of Laredo, Texas. For the families of the murdered women, the sentencing provided a sense of closure, but it was not the kind of closure anyone could truly heal from. They spoke to the media after the trial, their voices a mixture of grief and sorrow, but also, for some, a strange sense of justice. "We got justice, but it's not enough. It's never enough," said one family member, whose voice trembled with emotion. "Our loved ones are still gone. We will never get them back. But at least now, he will never hurt anyone else." For some, the verdict was the final step in a long and painful journey. His actions were the product of a deep-seated misogyny, a dark desire for control, and an increasing detachment from humanity. For those who had known him, the question of how this man had hidden in plain sight for so long was just as chilling as the murders themselves. How does someone like Juan David Ortiz, someone trusted with a weapon, someone who held authority, slip through the cracks for so long? Was it a failure on the part of law enforcement to see the signs? Was it a failure of the system to properly address the mental health of those who serve in such high-pressure, emotionally taxing jobs? These questions would remain unanswered, no matter how much time passed. For the families of the victims, no amount of inquiry could bring back their loved ones. No explanation could undo the pain they had endured. And yet, the deeper the investigation into Ortiz's life went, the more unsettling the answers became. Was he just a product of a broken system? Or was he a man who had been allowed to slip into darkness, unnoticed, because no one wanted to see the signs? As the years go on, the tragedy of these murders will continue to haunt Laredo, and the families of the victims will forever carry the scars of the man who betrayed their trust. They may never know if the system failed them, if something more sinister was at play, or if their loved ones' deaths were simply the result of one man's unexplainable darkness. One thing is certain, the legacy of Juan David Ortiz is not one that will be forgotten anytime soon. For the women he killed, for the families he destroyed, and for the community that had trusted him, this is a story of betrayal that will linger long after the trial and the sentencing. The unanswered questions will continue to echo, a reminder of the complexity of human nature, and the darkness that can lie hidden beneath the surface. As we come to the end of this chilling journey, it's important to remember the names of the women whose lives were taken. They were more than just victims. They were daughters, sisters, and human beings with hopes, dreams, and stories that ended too soon. Melissa Ramirez, Claudine and Luera, Giselda Alicia Cantu, and Janelle Ortiz, each of these women had a life worth living, a future that was stolen. Their deaths should not be overshadowed by the man who killed them. They deserve to be remembered for who they were, not just the manner in which they died. Their names should resonate, not just as a reminder of the pain caused by one individual, but as a symbol of the forgotten, marginalized victims that society so often overlooks. And yet, in this case, their deaths sparked something. Erica Pena's brave escape, her testimony, opened the doors to truth. It cracked open a case that no one could have imagined, a case that revealed the betrayal of someone who wore a badge, someone who was trusted to protect. Juan David Ortiz had been that protector, the man sworn to serve and safeguard his community, but instead, he became the very predator he was supposed to stop. He betrayed his position, his community, and the very people he was entrusted to protect. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? The badge, the uniform, the sense of authority, these are symbols of safety. But what happens when the person wearing it becomes the one you need protection from? Who watches the watchers? As we reflect on this, we invite you, the viewer, to join the conversation. What do you think created Juan David Ortiz? Was he born a monster, or was he shaped into one by the forces around him? What could have prevented this? Could this kind of betrayal have been stopped earlier? How much blame lies with the system that failed to notice the warning signs? We want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about the dark complexity of human nature, and how deeply buried resentments can fester in even the most trusted individuals. Thank you for taking this journey with us. The story of Juan David Ortiz is one that will leave a lasting impact, not just on the victims' families, but on all of us who hear it. Stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and remember the names of those who were lost.